battle to assert gender equality and transform the workplace. In today's conversation, our guests will discuss the ways in which women toe the line between authority and femininity and the ways that they present themselves at work. They'll also explore the historical origins of these pressures and the different forms they take. The panel will look at the enduring impact social biases have on opportunities for women in the workplace and the work that remains to be done going forward. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the live chat, and we'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Carlisle Companies. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the GBH Voices and Equity Fund, members of the Better Angels Society, including the Fullerton Family Charitable Fund, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the American Experience Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now it is my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Allison Elias is an assistant professor of business administration at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. Her research investigates historical and contemporary issues of gender and diversity in occupations and organizations, and she has provided commentary on gender issues at work to media outlets such as NPR's Marketplace. Anne Hood is the author of over a dozen novels, including the bestsellers The Knitting Circle and The Obituary Writer. She has also written several memoirs, including the bestseller Fly Girl, about her experiences as a TWA flight attendant in the 1970s and 80s. Her latest novel, The Stolen Child, will be released on May 7th. The conversation will be moderated by Monica Munoz Martinez. Professor Martinez is an award-winning author, educator, public historian, and active participant in developing solutions that address racial injustice. A national authority on the history of race, she is an associate professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you again for joining us, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Violet, and welcome, Anne and Allison. I'm honored to be here with you today to talk about the impacts that appearance can have on women's success in the workplace. This discussion is inspired in part by American Experience's new film, Fly With Me. Let's get started. So the first question I'd like to ask to Anne and then to Allison. Let's talk about how women have traditionally been expected to look and act in the workplace. What are some common themes?
Well, I was hired in 1978 to be a flight attendant for TWA. And by that time, they were trying to professionalize the job, and uniforms had become a little more military looking, a little less sexy. But that didn't mean that those old ideas from the 50s and 60s and early 70s were gone. We were still required to wear lipstick that matched the stripe in our uniform jacket, to have particular hairstyles. We would get off an airplane with a supervisor waiting to weigh us at a scale at the bottom of the stairs. Our heels, hems, and earrings were measured, and we were taught how to appear feminine and flirty.
The precision of thinking about having your lipstick match a particular part of your outfit and attire is kind of bewildering. Allison, could you talk a little bit more about the traditions of expectations of how women should act and in the workplace?
Sure. As Anne was saying, there were quite prescriptive, roles and expectations for women, and we must acknowledge that a lot of these ideas of femininity were racialized, and in particular for flight attendants, very white, as we see in the film with Black women who apply and get rejected from these roles because they're not seen as what the ideal type is supposed to be. In some of my research on office and clerical work, we see some really similar themes about women being mandated to wear skirts, being promoted based on appearance, and sexual harassment being described as a way of life, and not necessarily something that was seen as different or even inappropriate from men.
Could you speak a little bit more to that, Allison, specifically about how appearance and disposition affect how employers or supervisors see their female coworkers, and what role do gender biases play in these relationships?
Yeah, I mean, we know from social psychology that people are very wired to sort of categorize people by gender, race, or other sort of demographic characteristics. And so, in particular, in the office or on airplanes or in various workplaces, we tend to have this idea of what the role of a woman should be based on, usually on quite segregated roles between men and women. So, historically, men were sort of given certain types of jobs and opportunities, and women were cast into different roles. And so, in some ways, the women who filled these roles could be seen as quite similar in what they were expected to do or look like, or how they were expected to perform their gender. And that could be because a lot of times women were not seen as able to be as competent or as promotable as men. They were expected to just fulfill certain roles and limited in their progress at work.
Thank you. And I'm really interested to hear more about the airlines industry and the role of flight attendants who both had to look stereotypically feminine, but also had to show enough authority to put passengers at ease, that they knew the safety procedures, that they could lead in the time of crisis. As a flight attendant, did you feel a tension between those, the demands, the expectations of stereotypically looking feminine, but also having to show enough authority? How did you navigate those tensions?
It's such a great question. When you're on an airplane, it's the flight attendants who are going to evacuate if that aircraft needs evacuating. And we were really trained, even the training had that kind of push and pull, because we were trained on how to do that efficiently and effectively on 7 different kinds of aircraft, and how to get as many as 370 passengers off a plane that was in trouble. But we were also taught at the same time, in the same day, in a different class, how to perch on the armrest of a first class passenger seat to take their drink or meal order. And I will say that I feel like the passengers did not see us as the person who was going to get them off the airplane. We all know how much passengers pay attention to those safety procedures. And so it was really important to hold yourself, to have the poise, to feel the confidence in yourself and hope that it came through to the passengers as well. I mean, things like walking down the aisle once and a passenger was reading a book I had just read. And I said, "Oh, I loved that book." And he looked up with complete bewilderment and said, "You read?" And so we were put into a very particular mindset, especially for male passengers. But knowing why I was on that airplane and knowing how well trained I was, I think it kind of, for me, inwardly balanced that out.
It's amazing how much the film does a great job, and we'll see a clip later of the training and that expectation of responding always with a smile despite the circumstances, and just those examples that you shared just give you a quick glimpse into how difficult it might be to respond with a smile in those moments.
We were asked, does a flight attendant ever have a bad day? And the answer was yes, but she never shows it.
Well, this is interesting, not just for the flight industry. Thank you so much, Anne, for sharing that. Many working women have said that being respected at work in different industries means being aggressive. And actually that women have had to describe replicating the masculinity of male colleagues for respect. What do you make of this phenomenon, Allison?
This is quite a bind that women are in, particularly women working in market-driven jobs where being competitive and extremely aggressive is seen as the way to get ahead. I'm thinking in particular about the Ann Hopkins case, which was a Supreme Court case, of one of the first cases to decide that gender stereotyping was a form of sex discrimination under Title VII. Ann Hopkins was up for partner at Price Waterhouse, and was described as not feminine enough, and given feedback about her appearance, in particular that she needed to wear makeup and try to do her hair differently. And so I think that women who are entering into certain male dominated industries face this double bind of trying to be aggressive and very competitive, but then facing backlash in the form of either others not wanting to work with them or others seeing them as not feminine enough. And so it can be very difficult to get around that for women.
Another way to think about this is that women in the workplace understand the implicit expectation that we're supposed to be independent and self-motivated, but only to a manageable degree. And so I'm wondering, where do you think this conflict comes from, and how does it limit women? And I'll add on to that, how do women in the airline industry depart from that? How do they, they made tremendous contributions to the women's rights movement, to labor movements. And so I guess let's first think about how women, navigate being both independent and self-motivated, but manageable. And are there some examples that you could point us to where women just bucked that and organized?
Well, I'll say that flight attendants from the start, back when they were so-called hostesses or sky girls or stewardesses, they had all those names. They really were always at the forefront of women's rights. Starting way back at the beginning, the first 8 flight attendants, they had to sleep on the plane when they had layovers, and the pilots got hotel rooms. So the first right they won was that women get hotel rooms too. And then they had to share them, and they had to fight for getting their own room. But more importantly, they fought for things like keeping their job past the age of 32. TWA famously said, if a man doesn't want her when she's 32, TWA sure doesn't. They fought for rights to keep their job when they got married, definitely broke the gender rules by having men become flight attendants. And that was in the 70s. Fought for women to keep their jobs and still be able to have children. And that final frontier, which was the weight rule that we finally won in the 80s, that you can gain a normal amount of weight as women age or have children and not lose your job. My own roommate was fired for being 5 pounds over her hiring weight back in 1979. She had 3 chances to lose the 5 pounds, and she didn't, and she was fired. So we fought for really those basic rights, but also the bigger ones about pay equality and how to keep our job.
And just to hear that again, that was in 1979 that your friend lost her
Yes.
job for gaining
Yes.
5 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
Allison, did you want to add to that question?
Yeah, I think Anne brings up really great points, in particular about the limits of the law. And I think that, even though there were EEOC rulings in favor of flight attendants and, decisions that flight attendants' main purpose, was to provide safety and not necessarily just appearance, airlines found ways to still maintain certain regulations or get around these regulations. I also think the point about flight attendants being on the forefront of women's rights is a great one. And I think that they use so many different tactics and types of activism, from just individually withholding information about being married, for instance, to collectively organizing, to, initiating lawsuits, to, waging campaigns to ask which of us is 32. It's hard to tell. So all of these are really great examples of the multiple ways employees can have voice or, assert their own activism at work.
Thank you. Well, we've talked about the ways women are pressured to behave and appear at work, and we've begun to explore how some of these expectations are extensions of existing stereotypes, long-standing stereotypes. Let's take a look now at a clip from Fly With Me, where former flight attendants talk about growing up in the 1950s and 60s and the image of women in the family and in the workforce that was presented to them at the time. Let's watch now.
Margaret, I'm home.
We're in the kitchen. Growing up in the 1950s, it was very clear to me what women's roles were supposed to be.
The American home. Today, it is perhaps the most important job in the world.
It was reflected in television. It was reflected in the books I read. It was reflected in the examples used in my school lessons.
Father knows best.
I absorbed that. I didn't question it at all. It was just the way things were.
As a child, I used to dream of being a nurse. And then, of course, I wanted to be a mother. We were a happy family. So I thought, oh, that would be a nice thing to do. Have children and have a husband and the picket fence and all that type of thing.
There were all kinds of different expectations for men and women. They were basically considered two different types of human beings. Men were supposed to be the leaders, the presidents, the newspaper reporters, people who took dangerous jobs, people who took important jobs. Women were expected to get married and raise a family. But before that, it was expected that they would work at a number of lower-level jobs: secretary, clerk, librarian, teacher. They were not expected to have careers. My parents were opposed to my going to college. Their expectations for me were to get married and have a family. They felt that the fact that I had been a good student was already going to make it harder for me to find a husband.
In the clip, Patricia Ireland says that growing up, she didn't question how she was told women should be. We've been talking about institutional biases, but I want us also to explore if women themselves enforce certain behaviors and patterns of appearance through their own internal expectations of themselves or of other women. Anne, would you like to start?
Well, I think when you're in a job like I was, a flight attendant, it's a combination. I think it's both, because you are so required to look and act a certain way, and you're seeing other flight attendants around you and how they're interpreting that. I found a difference when I was based in New York City out of JFK. The women had a different kind of sophistication, and I remember wanting to seem more like that than the maybe more stereotypical flight attendant, which had the sunny smile and the all-American look. Those international flight attendants had something different going on that I really kind of admired and wanted to be like. I think it was very typical, and I bet it still is, for young women who want to be flight attendants to leave a certain kind of background, a small town, a certain class. They see such opportunity for that. They haven't probably been widely traveled. And so the job offered so much to me and to young women like me that I wanted the whole package. So I was happy to try to look like that flight attendant I admired walking across the halls of JFK into a 747.
The film does a great job of showcasing the recruitment of women to become flight attendants, to think about the opportunities and the adventure. And those seemed at tension also with the expectations of being manageable and, fitting very closely to the stereotypes. So you speak to that, thinking about a girl from a small town wanting to think, how can I explore? And that this created an opportunity for you and for others.
Yeah, I have a friend who was hired by TWA in the 1940s, and she was from a small town in South Dakota and went to Chicago to try to become a stewardess, as it was called then. And what she was told is, wear a skirt because we have to check your legs. And I said, how did that feel? And she said, when I walked across that room and I knew they were checking my legs, I also knew that I had good legs and I was going to get out and see the world. So it's that acceptance of knowing what's expected, but also kind of knowing why you're doing it.
And looking around for other models, like those international
That's right.
coworkers, colleagues that you could model. That there was another
Right.
sort of stereotype that you could look to, or women that were embodying different characteristics or a different sort of holding themselves in a different way. Allison, do women's internal expectations of how they should act limit their own ability to advance at work, whether it's limiting their self-confidence or their assertiveness? How does this play out in other industries and careers?
Yeah, I think it can limit women if they fully internalize all the messages about them. But I think most women have their own compass about where they want to go or what they want out of a job. As Anne was mentioning, this idea of exploration really is part of the duality of being a flight attendant or a stewardess. Is that wasn't really part of femininity, to get to explore the world or taste all sorts of cuisine from different countries, but that was something that women were able to avail themselves of through the job.
Another way to think about this is about equal pay for equal work. It's crucial to this conversation. According to the American Association of University Women, women still make about 16% less than men on average. How do gender stereotypes perpetuate this problem, and what is being done to overcome it in the modern workplace? Allison, let's go to you first.
Sure. Yeah, I think that a problem is that women's work is often devalued, even if it's really important work. And I think we see that in the example of flight attendants. These are women who are trained to provide safety and of the utmost importance on, an airline, yet they are being paid less than pilots or pursers or other male-dominated jobs. Of course, we see that in lots of female-dominated industries like teaching, childcare, librarian, even secretary. My work about secretaries really argues that they were actually extremely instrumental to the executive's job, and particularly ones who had worked for long periods of time with an executive were just as much managing the duties and tasks of his job as he was. But we do tend sociologically to devalue what women do. And part of that comes from the idea that women aren't the primary earners or breadwinners. So what they're working for is extra money or pin money, not necessarily providing for their families, which is just not true, simply not true now or in the past. And so these sorts of historical ideas get embedded into how jobs, are valued and the wages assigned to certain jobs, and then how people, employers place men, women, or other persons into their jobs.
And for flight attendants, this idea of equal pay for equal work was also intertwined with these ideas of the limits of what a mother can do or what a wife can do. And do you want to speak a little bit to that about the expectation, or, some of the policies to women being ineligible to work if they're married, and then later about women, flight attendants' abilities to become moms?
I think it's really kind of mind-boggling when things changed. Flight attendants fought for these rights for so long. It wasn't until the early 1980s that you could be married and have children and still be a flight attendant. I mean, think about that. That wasn't that long ago. And I happen to have been, unfortunately, in one of the worst labor strikes in the country, which was in 1986 when the TWA flight attendants went on strike for equal pay. The pilots and machinists had agreed on a contract where they took a 15% pay cut, and flight attendants were asked to give 27%. And the reasons given were we didn't have mortgages and we didn't run families. And so we weren't as important in the workforce. And of course, we all know that's not true, but imagine that that happened in 1986. And we lost that strike. We won in appeals, but initially we lost. And flight attendants were hired to replace us at about half of our pay, longer work hours, and a smaller pension, and less work rights. And so it was a huge step backwards for flight attendants and for women in labor. So we continue to fight to regain everything that we lost.
So you were having to contend with your employers and your coworkers in the industry.
That's right.
Well, we've taken a closer look at how biases build up over time and how they can shape how women see themselves and how they're expected to behave and appear at work. But this goes even further when companies take advantage of their employees to bolster their own image. Let's watch another clip from Fly With Me, where we see just how much the airline industry leveraged the image of the stewardesses to increase their bottom line. Let's watch now.
Chins up, stand up straight. Very good. That's fine.
When women were first hired on airplanes, the sales pitch around them was that having a mere girl willing to fly would help sell tickets. By the 50s, the pitch had flipped. Prices were fixed by the government. The airlines had to compete based on image and perks.
Airlines want to portray a vision of luxury and domesticity. Flight attendants really become the linchpin to that as hostesses.
They wanted someone who was stereotypically very beautiful. That was a way for an airline to distinguish itself and appeal to a largely masculine customer base.
The airlines really wanted a visual standardization of what a lovely stewardess looked like.
We all got our hair cut just the length of our chin bone. We were all supposed to look the same. Both our hair, but also our makeup. Red lipstick, mandatory. There was an idea, I think, to make us into little machine parts and not think of ourselves as individuals.
In our graduation photo, we look like 20 mannequins sitting in 2 rows. When I looked at it, I couldn't find myself. That was my first thing was, where am I in this photograph?
The grooming supervisors were former flight attendants. Their whole job was to make sure that your high heels were 3 inches tall, that you had white gloves that were white, no runs in your stockings. Your shoes were polished, not just the right heel height.
They'd look you over and gal would do like this to your buttocks to see if you had your girdle on.
They had this big piece of paper with appearance, hair, nails. You couldn't be too flashy.
You really need to have a good understanding of middle-class deportment, speech, manners, poise, as the airlines would put it.
They told us they wouldn't hesitate to kick us out of that class if we didn't do the right things.
Now a few cigarettes, sir.
Oh, no thanks, I have a fine cigar.
Well, may I put it out for you then, sir?
Put it out, I just lit it.
Some of the passengers get a little, well, you know how it is with people who don't smoke cigars.
Oh, no.
And the right things included always being friendly to everyone.
You see, you can handle just about any situation if you'll just smile and really mean it inside.
Just smile and really mean it. We see in the clip how flight attendants not only had their appearance policed, but were also expected to be happy and cheerful at all times. How much of your attention and energy did this focus on poise and appearance take up? It must have been, I just imagine, a full-time job just to keep up the appearance. And we've heard about, your work in organizing and going on strike. So how did you have time to think about things like your career or your rights with all of these other pressures being enforced? Having a friend that lost their job because they gained too much weight. I mean, how did you balance that?
I think, you're on that airplane for, I don't know, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, 3 or 4 days a week. And during those hours on the plane, your training is so good that you just start doing. I was laughing watching the flight attendants because that was me. I mean, a few decades later, but that was me. I got on there and I smiled and I complimented babies and I, told a woman that I liked her glasses and I took men's coats and I did all those things with a smile and I did service with a smile. That isn't who I was off the job necessarily. I remember being called in once by a supervisor because she said that while I was waiting to board a plane, I didn't look approachable because I was reading. And I said, but I was reading. I mean, and I wasn't really on duty. I was in uniform. And she said, but you weren't smiling. And I just thought, imagine being in your uniform and smiling as you read so that a passenger waiting to board would feel they could approach you with a question. I mean, that sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud, but it was taken seriously. I was like, wow, I'm in trouble,
for reading too closely to the text. Allison, airlines use the image of their flight attendants as an extension of their brand. Do companies still use the image of their employees as a promotional tool today?
I think in various ways they do. Obviously, perhaps not as overtly, as what we're seeing in this film. But there are ways that whoever is being advertised, whether they're actually an employee or paid actors or actresses, are part of building the brand image and the corporate image. And in particular, there's a lot of discussion about how corporations are trying to also profit off of sustainability and diversity initiatives and, how they're portraying themselves and trying to earn a certain reputation because of what's important to consumers today. So I think that some of this has shifted, but it's still very important.
For flight attendants, expectations around appearance and comportment weren't just a nuisance. We've heard from Anne examples that it could cost you your job. That kind of discrimination is illegal today, but women still contend with sexism and racism and inequality in the workplace. And do you have some thoughts to share about women who are contending with this today?
That's a great question. It's interesting. I saw a flight attendant application in the past couple of months for an airline now, a contemporary one. And I thought the wording was so interesting because because we won that case about our weight. It said, a flight attendant must be able to fit comfortably down the aisle, fit comfortably in the rows of seats, and be able to fit out the window in an evacuation. And that really made me pause because that's just a way of saying they can not hire you because of weight. And so I think on this more quieter level, women are still contending with these biases. I was surprised that anything like that would be in an application.
Allison, could you share a little bit more about the kinds of discrimination that, again, is illegal today, but women still contend with in the workplace?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to broaden the discussion to also other types of underrepresented persons at work, and just how people try to appear, how they try to speak, how they might even change their names, to try to get certain types of jobs. And so there's many different identities that people are grappling with as part of who they are, but don't necessarily seem to fit into what their employer might want. And so there's a lot of stress and work that people are experiencing trying to figure out what parts of themselves are appropriate to take to work, and what parts they need to hide or cover in different ways.
Thank you. Well, we have a lot of questions from the audience coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and start asking questions from the audience. One of them that relates to this, the conversation that we're having just now, is how have women in politics prevailed over the double bind in order to appear as an authoritative leader, but also as approachable and as feminine?
Yeah, I can speak to that first, and then I'd love to hear what Anne thinks. I felt like there was a lot of commentary and discussion and even research about this when Hillary Clinton ran for president, particularly about her pantsuits, coaching she received to try to be more likable, to smile more. And so, I think that what was interesting about her campaign, whether or not you supported her political beliefs, was that she did have extra work to do to try to manage her image as a woman, and then also her image as being very competent and authoritative. And I thought that sometimes people couldn't even describe what bothered her, them about her, and I think that that's perhaps some of the challenges that women leaders face today across industries. Is sometimes people just aren't sure about them. They're not sure if they trust them or like them, and some of this does have to do with some of these conflicting identities coming together. And so this is, I think, I would say, still a problem in politics and elsewhere, but would look forward to Anne's thoughts.
Well, one of the things that always strikes me is how the media always covers what women candidates and politicians wear still. And of course, don't mention or write about what the men are wearing. And I think really that's what we're looking at with women who are running for high offices or any office, really. We're still talking about whether they wear pants or not, or what colors they wear, or which designers they're wearing. I just think that should not be at the forefront. So it seems to me that women are still, despite running for president of the United States, and they're still getting fashion reviews.
Yes.
One question is, how do women dress to convey authority and power in the workplace? And you both have referenced the pantsuit, and how that tends even now to be something that can be grating for people to see a woman in a pantsuit rather than a skirt or a dress. I wonder if either of you have thoughts on that more broadly about how women do convey authority and power in the workplace by dress.
I know that in 1978, when I was hired by TWA, it was the first year flight attendants were allowed to wear pants as part of their uniform. And everyone was so excited. Again, that isn't that long ago. But you were not allowed to wear pants to the interviews. You had to wear a skirt or dress. So I think the idea of a woman in pants is still kind of threatening. Puts her on equal playing ground in some way with men.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting question, because thinking back to the 80s and the shoulder pads, which were sort of supposed to make women, I guess, take up more space or have broader shoulders, which would convey authority, and the idea of only wearing men's colors like gray or navy or charcoal. And I think that women in corporate America these days are sort of questioning that. I mean, some women are sticking to pantsuits and, dark colors, and some women are, I think, trying to reclaim some space and identity for themselves through just more broad choices that feel more like what they would select, outside of the workplace. And so, I'm not sure that I know of any quick answer to how to convey authority and power in the workplace. But I think that women are still trying to figure this out through, hairstyles, clothing, the makeup they wear, jewelry, all of that.
And, as a historian, of course, I'm always excited or interested to see women wearing all white as, a reference to suffragists, and thinking about those fashion choices that resonate across time to convey a kind of attitude and a commitment to change for a whole set of issues. And so there's there's the suit, and then there's the white suit that has a certain kind of resonance. Another question that we received is, does this condition begin earlier than in the workplace? Thinking about school dress codes, for example, and pressures for young women not to dress in a way that, quote, distracts their male peers. Could either of you speak to this this earlier years of formation that signal to girls and boys, or signal to people what gender stereotypes look like?
Sure, I can start with that. I think this question is getting to the idea that, young girls or girls in middle school are not supposed to wear maybe skirts that are too short, or tops that, show any part of their navel, or things like that. And I know that there's a lot of debates about that because, on the one hand, we maybe don't want our daughters to be sexual objects. On the other hand, what is freedom to choose what you want to wear. And so I think that this question is a really insightful one to show that this idea of socialization does start very early. And, the idea of policing how women look, or the fact that it's sort of women's bodies being on display or not supposed to be on display, is very real early on.
And there's, of course, that clip that we showed where Patricia Ireland is saying, I didn't question these expectations because they had been the expectations that I was familiar with. Mm-hmm. Anne?
I was thinking about the idea of middle school and what people wear, and I'm not sure what boys are allowed to wear. I mean, I'm not sure how equal it is. Are they allowed to wear tank tops, or are they allowed to show? I don't know. I don't know where we are today with that kind of thing. I know where we used to be. We all know, but I'm not sure if we've made any progress.
I think there's a lot of variety across schools and across states and regions, but even within cities. Another question that we received: are there resources or organizations you would recommend to learn more about women's appearance in the workplace and leveling the playing field for all women at work? So any recommendations for resources or organizations where people could learn more about women's appearance in the workplace and leveling the playing field for women at work?
Allison, I'm sure you have resources.
Yeah, I think that the question about women's appearances, I don't know of it sort of overtly being taken on by an activist organization. It's actually a really interesting thought. There's, great organizations that advocate for women at work, the National Organization for Women. There's research institutes like the Center for American Progress does a lot. There's an economic policy institute that looks at a lot of wage differences for women. So I think there's a lot of great, and the Women's Bureau at the U.S. government also puts out a lot of great reports. Panelists does a lot with women in corporate America, does a lot of reports and research. So I see a lot of great reports come out, but I don't necessarily see this question of appearance coming out overtly. And, perhaps that's because it does vary, just from job to job, what is expected. And so maybe it's kind of a hard issue to tackle.
Another question that takes us in a little bit of a different direction. Can we unpack the term, quote, resting bitch face? What are the gender stereotypes behind that term, and how can we unpack that?
And it's a terrible term. It's interesting someone asked that question. I'll tell you, the first time I heard it used, which was just a couple of years ago, I was kind of blown away that it even exists. I thought that we had come beyond using that word to describe a woman at all.
Yeah, I have to say, to me, it really screams of ageism, and I don't exactly know that there's a objective definition of what that type of face looks like, but to me, it sort of signifies somebody who doesn't, have a smile on their face or at rest, is not, maybe appears to be frowning, which we could say, is sort of just a result of aging. And so it's a very ageist term, obviously, in addition to being, gendered.
Yeah, I think part of it is that response, the expectation that one should smile, right? And that if somebody makes eye contact, that your face should acknowledge their eye contact and sort of
Right.
respond with a smile or a glow, perhaps. But as you pointed out, Anne, even sometimes women's ability to just read a book is to some people is not appropriate if you're not paying attention and saying hello and being welcoming. I think we have time for one last question, and this is asking about pay gap. Are there industries where the pay gap is particularly large today?
One thing that I think with all the Oscar buzz that went on this week, I read quite a bit about the big pay disparity in acting, and females, the actresses, fighting to get paid as much as their equal co-stars. So that surprised me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that actually, I'm glad you brought up film. I know this is a big issue in professional athletics today, particularly. I know it's attention is from in soccer, professional soccer, and professional basketball.
Yeah.
I would just say for people interested in the pay gap, the economist Claudia Golden recently, won one of the highest, prizes for economists, and her research is all about the pay gap. And she contends that a lot of the pay gap has to do with whether it's worse in industries where people are overworking for greater wages, or there's not flexibility. And so those are places where women, tend to earn less, and men are able to out earn.
Okay, I'm glad we have some more time for more audience questions. And I think this question is for you. How much residue from the sexist era exists for flight attendants today?
I wish I knew really specifically. I do still have friends who are still flying. They started with me in the late 70s, and they're still on airplanes. They all happen to be men. My female friends, my women friends have moved on. I feel like that sex kitten image that I had to contend with, I think that's mostly gone. I feel like when I get on an airplane, the flight attendants look all kinds of ways, all different sizes, shapes, ages. I definitely notice older flight attendants, which makes me really happy. In fact, I've met so many of them when I was on my book tour for Fly Girl. I met at least half a dozen, maybe more, women who became flight attendants at the age of 60 or older, who wanted to do it when they were young, and either their parents wouldn't allow them to, or they didn't get hired, or they got married young and you couldn't be married, and have gone back and are so happy. So it makes me really glad that ageism appears to not be getting in the way of hiring flight attendants. That was pretty delightful. And they're all just tickled that 40 years after they first wanted to be a flight attendant, now they are one.
Allison, thank you. And Allison, another question that we received is, are there certain jobs where being attractive is explicitly part of the job even today? We were just talking about the film industry. I wonder if you can say more about that industry or if you can think of others.
Yeah, I do know, and this is referenced in the film, there are exceptions to this idea of not being allowed to hire based on appearance or sex. The BFOQ exceptions to Title VII, where if you're hiring an actress, you can hire somebody that is a certain appearance or age for the part. I think it's more subtle in other types of industries where maybe there's just assumptions made if you don't necessarily look polished, or whatever professional means for that industry, whether it means you're not wearing appropriate makeup, or your clothes are wrinkled, or you don't look like the right body type. I think that plays out over and over again, but in ways that are maybe unconscious and subtle. And we don't necessarily, people aren't necessarily making overt hiring decisions based on appearance, although it is part of how they're drawing conclusions about what that person is like, or what they would be like as an employee.
Thank you. One other striking part of the film is again the contributions that flight attendants made to women's rights and labor rights more broadly. And were there any more takeaways that you hope people will remember about that organizing and that commitment to change?
Well, I think the film is really an eye-opener for people. I've heard from so many people that they had no idea, even though they know me and they knew I was a flight attendant and knew me when I was a flight attendant, that they had no idea what flight attendants had done for women's rights. So I think it's so important. I think everyone should watch the film, but once you do, or after listening to this conversation, maybe minds will change. When you get on the airplane, you'll look differently at the person asking you what you'd like to drink and handing you a stale bag of pretzels. You'll look differently at them, and that hopefully extends to not just flight attendants, but women in all roles, right, in all workforces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people will learn an incredible amount about the industry and the contributions, also about the long history of integration in the industry that I think many people will learn a lot from. One final question for both of you. I guess it'd be great to hear, how do we create workspaces where a woman's femininity doesn't determine how successful she is, how well she's treated, or how much she's paid? I'd love for both of you to weigh in on what we can do to create workspaces where a woman's femininity doesn't determine how successful she can be. You told us just a little bit, Anne, about how we can do that as consumers and flyers. What else can people do to create workspaces that don't determine a woman's success based on their femininity?
It's social change. And so I think it's bigger than just a few pointers that they can take. It's within all of us, within all of our abilities, to let go of some of those really stale ideas and respect women and not judge them. That phrase we were asked about is a great example of how mindsets are still kind of back in the dark ages. And I think it's up to us to create those workspaces. It's up to us to change minds.
Yeah, I would just say that the phrase social change, I think, is a good one, that these are issues that exist outside of the workplace, and are going to require sort of long-term systemic change, because the workplace sort of reflects the broader reality in society. So I think that as perhaps as more men and women integrate into different jobs and it becomes more commonplace to see different types of people in different jobs, that could also be helpful, the changing composition of occupations.
And it does sound like from, gathering from the thread from our conversation so far is that there's different needs in different fields and different industries. So we've talked about, in politics, for example, it's not just what a politician might decide to wear, but how commentators or journalists might cover women's dress. And so, I can imagine that the kinds of guidance or the expectation or, better practices to lead to cultural or social form is something that's specific to different industries. And so I wonder if you have other thoughts, Allison, of particular insights that we could ground in another industry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The one example that just came to mind was, a lot of MBA students want to be management consultants. And there's an interesting teaching case we look at about Indra Nooyi, who was a management consultant at BCG before moving, into strategy at Pepsi. And, she actually wore her sari to her BCG interview during business school and talks about how, although she was coached not to do it by the career office, she wanted to sort of show part of herself. And so, I think as employers and especially maybe, leading companies become more aware of these issues and explicitly bring them into the conversation around hiring practices, perhaps that will give people more freedom to express themselves or to be able to look in diverse ways and not have to fit into a specific stereotype related to their, demographic characteristics.
Thank you, Allison. That's such a great example. And it's one that reminds us it's not just about everyday practices, but those important decisions that people make when they're hiring, and that is still a conscious decision for people deciding what to wear when they enter the room. Well, thank you so much, Anne and Allison, to both of you for joining us for this conversation today. There's much more we could say, but we're out of time. So I'll pass it back to Violet for closing remarks. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation exploring how expectations around appearance impact women at work. Fly With Me is now available to stream in full on our website, our YouTube channel, and on the PBS app. You can watch our past forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, opportunities to watch new films live with us, and more. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great evening.